Whidbey Island sits in the Puget Sound off the coast of Washington State, a place of dense trees, quiet roads, and cold water stretching toward the horizon. It is the kind of place where people know each other's names, where the same families gather at the same events year after year, where the past and present exist side by side without much distance between them. It was on this island, down a dark and secluded dead-end road, that Russell Douglas was found shot once in the head on the morning of December 26, 2003. He was 32 years old. He had a wife, he had 2 children, and someone had waited for him in the dark. Russell Douglas was not a man who collected enemies. Everyone who knew him described a steady, decent person who had no business being at the center of a murder investigation. His estranged wife, Brena Douglas, owned a hair salon on the island. Their marriage had fractured, and Russ had been staying with Brena and the children over the Christmas holiday in an effort to hold things together. On the morning after Christmas, he left. He never came back. Island County Sheriff's Detective Plumberg was called to the scene that night. Russell was found inside a vehicle in a darkened driveway. The door open, a single gunshot wound to his head, a massively traumatic wound. Plumberg and a colleague drove to notify Brena. When she came to the door, she crossed her arms, leaned against the frame, and said nothing more than "May I help you?" There were no questions, no immediate rush of panic, no flood of words. Plumberg noted all of it. In his experience, the silence after that kind of news was as telling as anything spoken aloud. Brena mentioned that her husband had been unfaithful. She said their marriage had been difficult, that there had been emotional tension and at times physical confrontation. She said all of this before she had even asked who might have done it. Within weeks of the murder, investigators discovered that Brena carried significant debt and that 2 life insurance policies on Russell's life would pay out somewhere in the range of $400,000 to $500,000 upon his death. That money would have solved her financial problems entirely. Brena was never charged. There was nothing connecting her to the scene, nothing tying her hands to the act. But she remained in the background of the investigation, never fully gone from the picture. The leads dried quickly. No witnesses, no weapon, no clear path forward. Plumberg spent 7 months working the case without a break in any direction that mattered. Then a call came from Florida. The man on the other end of the line played bass in a band called Buck Naked and the Exhibitionists, performing on small stages along the west coast of Florida. His name was Bill Hill, and he had been carrying a secret for 6 months before he could no longer hold it. He told Plumberg about his lead guitarist, a man named Jim Huden. Hill said that during a late-night drive to a gig, just 1 month after Russell Douglas was murdered, Huden had confided in him. He said he needed to get something off his chest. What followed was not what Hill expected. Jim Huden told Hill that he had been abused by his stepfather as a child. He said that the experience had stayed with him, shaped him, and that at some point he had decided to act on it in a specific and violent way. He said he had gone looking for someone who fit that profile of an abuser, someone he could target. He said he found that person in Russell Douglas. And then he told Hill that he had shot him once in the head. Hill sat with that knowledge for 6 months before making the call. Plumberg had never heard the name Jim Huden before. But as Hill kept talking, the story began to take a shape that connected back to someone Plumberg had already spoken to. Hill said Huden had not acted alone. He said the first person involved was Jim's girlfriend, a woman who had grown up on Whidbey Island and now lived in Las Vegas working as a limousine driver. Her name was Peggy Sue Thomas. Plumberg knew that name. He had spoken to her months earlier when her Las Vegas phone number appeared in Russell Douglas's call records. She had called Russ several times in the days before his death. At the time, she explained she was on the island for the holidays and had been trying to reach him to deliver a Christmas gift on behalf of their mutual friend, Brena. Her answers had been smooth and natural. Nothing had raised a flag. But now, with Hill's information in hand, Plumberg looked at those phone calls differently. Peggy Sue Thomas was not someone who blended quietly into the background. At 48, she had already lived several full and visible lives. She had served in the Navy as an aircraft mechanic during Operation Desert Storm, a woman in a field that did not always welcome women, and she had carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from proving something. Later, in her late 30s, she physically transformed herself and entered the Mrs. Washington International pageant. She won. The crown, the sash, the photographs on her wall at home told the story of a woman who understood how to present herself to the world. By 2003, she was driving limousines in Las Vegas for high rollers, earning tips in the thousands for a single night. She was glamorous, social, and good at her work, and she was quietly, intensely involved with a man named Jim Huden. Jim and Peggy had grown up together on Whidbey Island. She had a childhood crush on him, but their lives diverged, and they went separate ways for years. In June 2002, they reconnected at a funeral back on the island. Both had lost someone they cared about, and in that shared grief, they found each other again. Things moved quickly. Within months, they were deeply involved. There was one significant problem. Jim Huden was married to a woman named Jean, and they lived together in Punta Gorda, Florida. Jean had no knowledge of Peggy in the beginning. Jim was a software developer who had sold a program to Microsoft and done well for himself. He told Jean he was traveling to Las Vegas looking for gigs with his band. He was actually meeting Peggy. Jean began to notice changes in her husband after that funeral. He grew darker and more withdrawn. He started drinking heavily and using drugs. He became someone she did not fully recognize. What she did not know was where he was going when he left town. In April 2003, Jean answered her front door and found Peggy standing on her porch. The two women had the kind of conversation that tends to strip away all pretense. Jim told both of them he loved two women. He said he wanted to be with Jean. Peggy left furious, but within weeks she and Jim were back in contact, and by the fall of 2003 the affair had fully resumed. In December 2003, Jim told Jean he was going home to Whidbey Island to spend the holidays with family. He went to the island. He was with Peggy. On the morning of December 26, he told her he was stepping out to buy cigarettes. It was somewhere between 10 and 11 in the morning, right around the time Russell Douglas was killed. Plumberg believed that Peggy had used her connection to Brena to lure Russell to that dead-end road with the promise of a holiday gift. He believed Jim had been waiting there with a gun. One shot, close range. Russell never had a chance. Bill Hill had also given Plumberg a second name connected to the plot. He said Jim had told him that Brena Douglas had knowledge of what was going to happen, though Hill drew a distinction between knowing and actively participating. And Hill said Jim had described the financial arrangement. Peggy was to receive a portion of the insurance payout, and Jim was supposed to receive $50,000 for pulling the trigger. By August 2004, Plumberg had enough to move. He flew to Punta Gorda and sat across from Jim Huden. He looked him in the face and told him he knew he had pulled the trigger. Jim denied it. He sat in that room and denied everything, calling himself a bad person in some ways, but insisting he was no killer. The session ended without a confession. Jim asked for a lawyer, and the conversation was over. At the same time, law enforcement executed a search of Peggy's home in Las Vegas. Officers with weapons drawn moved through her house, placed her in handcuffs, and put her in a laundry room while they collected computers, photographs, and personal effects. When they questioned her, she denied any knowledge of the murder weapon. She denied any involvement. She answered every question and then called Jim. He told her on that call that he had done it. He told her he was sorry for getting her involved. He told her he loved her, then he hung up. Jim Huden disappeared shortly after. Hurricane Charlie hit the west coast of Florida that August, and in the chaos that followed, Jim was simply gone. Investigators had no indictment, no warrant, and no hard evidence strong enough to charge him. He walked out of the reach of Island County law enforcement and vanished. He resurfaced more than 2,000 miles away in Veracruz, Mexico, where he lived under the name Jim Martin. He had a circle of friends, played in local bands, performed on stage, and spent long hours sitting in his favorite spots watching people walk by. The people who knew him there remembered a thoughtful and emotionally intelligent man who was careful never to speak about his past. He told those close to him that there were things he would not share. and not to ask. He had not found his way to Mexico alone. Jim Huden had helped him cross the border. She had supported him financially from a distance and visited him during those years. She carried the secret of where he was, while investigators on Whidbey Island worked with nothing. Peggy continued her life in Las Vegas. She drove limos, kept a low profile, and in 2007 met a multi-millionaire oil man named Mark Allen through a limousine booking. He was instantly taken with her. They married. He owned a Kentucky Derby winner. He had wealth on a scale that Peggy had never been close to. The marriage lasted 7 months before it unraveled, but not before Peggy received $700,000 and a houseboat in the settlement. During that time, a woman named Vicky Boyer, who had been Peggy's close friend for years and had always believed in her innocence, found herself rethinking everything after a night in a bar. She said Peggy, drunk, made a comment about knowing how to handle a problem for a friend and mentioned something about a gun. Then she said that at least this time she would know to throw it in the water. Vicky went home shaking. She was certain of something she had previously refused to believe. Back in Florida, Jim Huden's life had fallen apart by 2011. Drug addiction, multiple arrests, charges stacking up. Facing serious prison time, she finally told investigators where Jim had been. Mexican authorities arrested Jim Huden in Veracruz and returned him to Whidbey Island nearly 8 years after Russell Douglas was shot dead. 1 month later, Peggy Sue Thomas was arrested and charged with murder. Jim's trial came first. The prosecution's central witness was Bill Hill, the bass player who had listened in silence during that late-night drive in January 2004 and then spent 6 months deciding what to do with what he had heard. He took the stand and testified about exactly what Jim had told him. He could not look at Jim while he spoke. Jim Huden never testified in his own defense. After 8 days, 20 witnesses, and less than 4 hours of jury deliberation, the verdict was guilty. Jim Huden was sentenced to 80 years in prison. Peggy's trial was scheduled for 6 months later. The prosecution's strongest witness was Jim Huden, who now claimed that Peggy had personally admitted involvement in the murder. Jim said Jim had told her Peggy was part of it, and that Peggy herself had confirmed it directly. Defense attorney Craig Platt dismantled that testimony point by point. When Jean had originally spoken to detectives back in 2004, she had said Jim never told her Peggy was involved. 7 years later, her story had changed entirely. Jean admitted under questioning that her memory might not be accurate. She admitted it was possible she had said something different. Platt called her a roadmap of inconsistencies and argued that the prosecution was trying to convict a woman on the word of someone whose account had shifted with the years. 1 week before Peggy's trial was set to begin, the prosecutor offered a deal: 4 years in prison on a reduced charge of rendering criminal assistance. Peggy accepted. She said afterward that no innocent person would accept prison time if they had any real chance of being acquitted. But she said the community had been fed a version of events for years, and she did not believe she would receive a fair trial. She said she was giving up 4 years of her life for something she did not do. Whether that is true is something only a small number of people alive can answer with certainty. Jim Huden is in a prison cell serving 80 years. Brena Douglas was never charged. Investigators found no evidence that money ever changed hands between Brena, Jim, and Peggy, but those who worked the case said privately that Brena never stopped being a person of interest. Russell Douglas was trying to repair his marriage when he died. He drove to a meeting on a dead-end road on the day after Christmas, and someone he may or may not have known put a gun between his eyes and fired once. His children grew up without a father. His name circled through years of courtrooms and depositions and press coverage, while the people who shaped his fate navigated plea deals and fugitive escapes and affairs and insurance policies. The gun that killed him, a .380 Bersa, turned up in New Mexico. A friend of Jim Huden's told police Jim had given it to him at Peggy's house in Las Vegas. The ballistics matched the shell casing and the bullet pulled from Russell's skull. It was the most concrete piece of evidence in the entire case, and it came from a tip out of nowhere from someone who had no idea what he was holding. Whidbey Island is still quiet, The road where Russell was found is still dark and isolated. The trees still close in from both sides, and the water is still cold and gray in December. Some places hold on to what happened in them long after the people involved have moved on. This one is no different.